Okay, so today we're going to talk about why counterplans need solvency advocates and explicitly like how you would make a 2AC theory argument that the counterplan needs to have solvency evidence. Otherwise, it should not be seen as legitimate. Okay, so I'll start by laying out kind of the premise of what can happen in debates that becomes a bit of a problem. And it goes something like this. You read your affirmative, and then the 1NC is just like, hey, we should counterplan to like have a constitutional convention to do the plan. Or they're like, we should counterplan to generate some made up process that we've never heard of to do the plan. Or even a counterplan that just starts to fiat out of your impacts, but they don't really have any evidence that substantiates the thing that they're talking about could or should happen. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we say a counterplan without a solvency advocate or a counterplan without solvency evidence. Now, this presents like a huge problem for the affirmative because if the counterplans don't have solvency evidence, there's very little way to have research that responds to these counterplans. So the number one biggest issue that this produces for the affirmative is that it's really hard when we go to library time at night or when we're doing research to find things that answer arguments that aren't based in the literature. So one thing that you all have probably noticed while we're cutting our affirmative is we try to cut all of the cards about our solvency mechanism or about our idea, and then we cut people who respond to them for our negative arguments. And then the affirmative process of research is iterative, where we say, okay, here are the answers to the people who write evidence against us. Let's cut answers to them. And our idea during these first week and a half, first 2 weeks of research at the DDI is that we're going to go forward and we're going to write our affirmative. And in doing so, we're going to find every article that talks about what we should do about the problem that we have pointed out in our 1AC. So like, if we're writing the AI app, we're writing everyone, we're going out and we're cutting and we're reading cards from every single person who writes about like, here is what we should do in order to regulate AI. Here is what NATO can do. Here are what our alternative actors could do, et cetera. And then the 2AC or the 2A would go through writing blocks based on every potential thing that exists. And you would go into the library and do research on those things. And as you all can probably tell, that task is already quite large. It is quite difficult to say that you're going to cut cards on every single thing that exists in terms of your solvency evidence, but also in terms of your internal links and your impacts. So maybe you get to like AI regulations are key to solve warming. Okay, now you need to do research on all of the proposals of other ways that we could solve warming, right? So it's a pretty large research burden. Now, it is a manageable one solely because you're restricted to what exists on the subject matter. By which I mean, you look through and while you're prepping, you say, here are all of the possible suggestions that exist about all of our solvency arguments, all of our internal links, all of our impacts, et cetera. And you can say, well, this is a predictable list of things that we need answers to. And it is predictable for the affirmative because the literature has been driving their research process. Now, when you introduce a counterplan that is not discussed in the literature, it introduces a large problem that there is no reason to expect that the affirmative would have prepared for it. And there is no way to expect that the affirmative would have reasonable to good responses to it because no one in the literature considers it to be a real idea. So the first argument that we want to make about why having a solvency advocate is good is that it is key to predictability. The only way that it is possible that we could predict the arguments that are going to be made by the other team is that there is literature on them that discusses their possibility. The second thing about this is thinking about why is it that we go to the library to do research? And there are two primary reasons that we're doing this. Reason one, you all are high schoolers. Even when you graduate high school, you'll be college students, and you have relatively low knowledge about the subject matter of the topic. There are people who spend their entire life studying NATO and NATO policy and emerging technology. They have PhDs. They've been studying this for years and years and years. And they are still debating between themselves about what is a good or realistic set of options that we could put forward, right? It is only educational as a research activity if we have to follow the research and what is being written, rather than attempting to force the research to confine to some arbitrary debate ideas that we have come up with. So rather than us just, oh, well, we get the state's counterplan because we always get the state's counterplan. We get this genre of argument because this genre of argument is always in debate. That is a fairly anti-educational model, an anti-research-based model of debate, because it discourages us from thinking and looking for cards, and it discourages us from knowing anything about the topic controversy. Think about the fact that almost any backfile process counterplan could be reread on any topic. And the reason is because it's not pressed to have a specific solvency card about the affirmative. Now, that is, I think, a large education argument that you should be putting forward about why this is important, but it also produces a large argument about 2AC strategy or affirmative ground about why counterplans should need solvency cards. And that argument goes something like this. The affirmative will only have evidence that responds to a proposal if it is true that the proposal exists in the literature and there are people who care about it. When we are doing research, we are reading through work by scholars and other scholarly individuals. And when they are considering things, they're writing responses to what other people who are academically taken seriously are saying. If the negative does not have to put forward counterplans that exist by people who are taken seriously in the literature, or they don't have to put forward things that have been published, there's no reason that there would be responses written, which means that the 2AC will never have decent evidence that they were able to read. Okay, so far, the arguments that we have for this are, 1, we have a predictability argument, 2, we have an education argument, and 3, we have an affirmative ground argument. The last kind of argument that we could make about why forcing the negative to have a solvency advocate is good is that it encourages negative research. It encourages negative research. Right now, if you have a model that says the negative does not need cards about the AF, they will always just say that they have the most generic piece of evidence and then change their counterplan text to fiat through every logical response that you could make, which means that the negative is discouraged from cutting cards. Think about the EU, the US should cooperate with the EU counterplan. If that counterplan does not require the negative to have evidence about the specific AF that they're debating, they would never cut those cards because those specific cards don't help. The specific cards just say the US and the EU could cooperate on this and it would be beneficial, but the negative can always just say fiat means that we force it so that the US would propose this and they could cooperate. So the issue is that fiat acts as the warrant in most counterplans as opposed to in other places. So it's really hard to make responses to counterplans unless there are specific disadvantages or reasons that the counterplan should not exist. Does that make some sense? So counterplans require a bit more specificity in answering them, which is one of the generic reasons why research in literature is so important and should constrain the capacity of the negative to engage in fiat. So in general, we have these 4 categorical arguments against the negative producing counterplans without a solvency advocate. Like most theory arguments, in the 2AC, if we wanted to say the negative needs a solvency advocate for their counterplan, we would go to a counterplan that doesn't have one, and we would say that counterplans without a solvency advocate are a voting issue, and then provide our favorite 1 to 2 reasons why that is true. So it could be that you think the predictability one is best or the AF ground one is best. Those ones seem best to me. It could be that you really like the education one or that you really like the disincentivizes negative research one. It could also be that you have a different way of framing or combining these arguments, but that's really up to you. Now, in response to the argument that counterplans need solvency advocates, there are a few kind of generic arguments that the negative is always going to put forward. First, the negative is always going to say that it is illogical to say that we need a solvency advocate, by which they'll say either this isn't really logically sound or it discourages critical thinking. So if we came up with an idea that disproves the 1AC, then it proves logically that it's something that we should consider in a debate. This argument is intuitively appealing insofar as they're basically saying but the counterplan's a good idea. So we should think about things on the spot. The issue with this argument generally is there is almost certainly a reason that the counterplan is not taken seriously in the literature that we just can't know about because we're not the scholars who are writing about it. So the only way that we know if an option is a serious one is vis-a-vis research, AKA the only way that we know what are the logical options to be put out there are the options that are actually considered by people who study this stuff. And the issue usually exists as such. There is usually some legal or other process thing that would stop the counterplan from being implemented that we just don't know about because no one would discuss the legal impossibility of it occurring. So maybe the US just doesn't have a channel to interact with the EU about the affirmative in the way that we are talking about. And the reason that there is no literature for either the affirmative or the negative is there is literally no mechanism that exists to move forward on this. And it should be the negative's burden to prove that the counterplan has the possibility of doing all of its mechanisms, but fiat lets the negative just say, well, we'll just pretend that it exists. And that's kind of a huge issue because there's no reason that anyone would ever put forward the cards that say that this is impossible. So our biggest answer to the logic argument is actually that we don't know the parameters of what is and is not possible around every single facet of the affirmative. And the only way that we would know what is possible is vis-a-vis literature. Like literature determines what is possible because it is experts who can tell us how things actually work. Whereas in general, we know a lot less about all of the nitty-gritty processes of cooperation over AI than people who are like exclusively working in this field. Okay, the second issue with any standard that is about logic in debate in general is that debate is not predicated on being logical. It is just like a fallacy that the concept of debate is that we only have logical arguments. For example, there's pretty much consensus that new 2AR arguments are bad, despite the fact that a new 2AR argument could be logical and it could be true. Why is it the case that we don't consider new 2AR arguments despite the fact that they might be logical arguments to put forward? It's because it would not be fair to the negative team. In the same way, if we prove that counterplans without solvency advocates are not fair or they are not predictable for the affirmative team, they ought be rejected even if they are logical. The other big example of this, which honestly mirrors on pretty well, is intrinsicness. We almost always say that the affirmative cannot do the plan and add something that is not either in the plan nor the counterplan in the 2AC because it would be unfair. Yet, doing the plan and also guaranteeing that the agenda DA passes is a perfectly logical thing for a judge or a decision maker to do. So if we're willing to throw out the concept of logic in all of these other instances, what is the reason that we're not willing to throw out the concept of logic here? To me, it doesn't make a ton of sense. Now, I think the second argument that a lot of teams will make against the solvency advocate argument is some iteration of like, we are the solvency advocate, we came up with the thing, so like, that's good enough. Now, this argument in the abstract sounds funny. It's like, they said, well, we advocated it in the 1NC, thus we are the solvency advocate, thus it has a solvency advocate. Okay, that's like a good enough use of twisting our words around, but it's not particularly useful for the thing that the affirmative is saying. The thing that the affirmative is saying is that there must be research that suggests that we ought do the counterplan. And the reason that this research ought exist is because it is the only way for us to know that there are responses and for us to prepare and predict the counterplan before it occurs in the debate. So it's the only predictable basis for affirmative preparation, and it is the only basis for which we would have affirmative evidence that responds to it. So the fact that you have said this is more or less irrelevant to the fact of whether or not it is in the literature, which is the real thing we're attempting to test. In other words, even if they literally are a solvency advocate, our interpretation of solvency advocate should be one that is a qualified piece of evidence in the field that suggests that the thing that the counterplan is suggesting is a good idea. Now, the third argument that the negative team is almost certain to put forward is that this eliminates all counterplans or that the threshold is just way too high, because they'll be like, we have a card that suggests something like the EU can cooperate with the US instead of the US cooperating with NATO. So why is that not a sufficient solvency advocate? Our argument should be that the solvency advocate for the negatives counterplan has to say that we should do the thing that the counterplan says we should do, which seems more or less straightforward if we think of what is a solvency advocate. So if it does not suggest the proposal that you are writing, you do not get that argument as a negative counterplan. Now, this doesn't eliminate all counterplans for a few reasons. One, you could always read advantage counterplans. You can read a counterplan that just says like, the United States should establish a carbon tax in order to solve global warming. There are a million cards about that. There are a million cards about basically every advantage counterplan you could read. So we definitely guarantee that the negative gets advantage counterplans. Two, we guarantee that the negative gets counterplans that are about the affirmative. So you could write a large counterplan that says the best way to solve AI is for the US and the EU to have the following set of regulations. And you're right, that counterplan doesn't get to mimic or do the exact thing that the plan does. By and large, that is a benefit of our interpretation, not a cost of it. It is good that the negative doesn't get to mirror our policy exactly without very specific research, because that set of counterplans are bad for debate insofar as they largely moot the 1AC and discourage clash. By which I mean, if there is no one who is writing about this, there is no in-depth debate about comparing the plan to the counterplan. And furthermore, it is good for the plan and the counterplan to have large divergences because they leave us more opportunity for debating. Lastly, number three, they do get process counterplans insofar as they are literally about the 1AC. And I think that this is a really cool argument to make because it's really the only non-arbitrary way to describe what process counterplans are good and bad anyway. So like, sure, if you have a card that says we should consult the EU about doing this thing with NATO, you can definitely read that counterplan. And in that instance, the consult counterplan is really good. Sometimes the consult counterplan is in the literature and something we should talk about. Similarly, if you have a card about the states counterplan, the conditions counterplan, the word pick, any of these things that are literally about the affirmative, it is probably a good thing for the negative to get to read those. However, when you have a process counterplan that has nothing to do with the affirmative, you should not get to read this. Now, this is a really nice argument because it lets you differentiate between good and bad process counterplans, and it leaves it on a standard that makes some sense to people, which is like, if this is the research that you would do on this thing, it is really, really good for you to get that counterplan. If it does not derive from the research, it is bad because it is impossible for the affirmative to clash and proves that the counterplan and its net benefit are entirely artificial in this instance. Does that make some degree of sense? Because I think the trickiest thing about this is that you get to say you get the more what we would consider illegitimate counterplans sometimes, but only if they have a solvency card. The other reason that I think this is a nice way to talk about this is because from judges that I have interacted with and talked to, almost all of them agree with the following thing. If it is true that the negative has a card that says, instead of doing the plan, we should do the counterplan, then that counterplan is almost always legitimate. So if that is a standard that people are willing to use to say that a counterplan is legitimate, we should hold the corollary thing to be true, which is if you do not have a card that suggests that the counterplan should occur, it is likely not legitimate. Now, some people will push back against this and say that, but your 1AC largely suggests that our counterplan idea is a good idea. So you've read a 1AC, and in your 1AC, you read a card that's like, a US-Russia war goes nuclear. So they're like, counterplan, the US will not go to war with Russia. Now, if it is true that our 1AC says that that should be the solution to the thing, then the negative should just cut that card during the debate, and then they can read the counterplan. They should just cut that card during the debate, and then they can read the counterplan, which is all to say that, like, actually, if our 1AC puts forward this argument, then just recutting it proves that we solve negative ground, because you do get the counterplan you're talking about if you are not lazy and you literally go through the process of recutting our evidence, which is not that difficult of a thing to do. Does this make sense? Okay, the next big argument, I think, that the negative is capable of putting forward on solvency advocate theory is that counterplans without solvency advocates are core to check new affirmatives, or they are core functional limits. And this one's a little bit tricky. Their argument goes as such. Look, if we were debating against a new affirmative, there is no way that we would have a specific solvency advocate. So putting us on that burden means that new affirmatives will always win. I have a few responses to this argument. One, we didn't read a new affirmative. So maybe you can do different things when you debate a new affirmative. This is not one of those instances, so you don't need a counterplan without a solvency card. 2, their argument in all presumes that new affirmatives are bad, and we could just say that like maybe we should encourage people to write new affirmatives. Writing an affirmative is fairly difficult to do, and spending the time going through and finding all of this research is a net good thing. Not to mention, when you write a new affirmative, you do have to cut answers to all of these counterplans because it is possible the team that you are debating has found these counterplans. So given how high we are making the burden on the affirmative for all of the counterplans they have to answer, it seems reasonable to suggest that the negative would also have to have evidence on these, and that cutting an AF is not something that someone can do overnight. 3, if our affirmative is topical and predictable, it follows that you should have prepared for it prior to the debate. Like, we are reading an affirmative where we have met every T argument that the 1NC reads, presumably. If we haven't, we're going to lose the debate on T, right? If it is the case that our affirmative is topical, it follows that the negative should be able to predict our affirmative. If the negative is able to predict our affirmative, they should have cut a case neg, particularly because there are so many case negs floating around from all of the camps who put out arguments. 4, I think it's important to point out that the topic is generally not that large. It seems a lot bigger and scarier than it is, but even at this camp, I think like half of the labs have written the Article 5 or cyber attribution AF, and like half of the labs have written the like AI framework for interoperability AF, and almost none of the labs have written biotech AFs. The reason for this is because there just aren't actually that many people who say that topical things should occur on the resolution, and a topical affirmative has to outweigh DAs. It has to be able to answer some set of counterplans that there are cards for. It has to beat core critiques, and it has to beat topicality. So there are already a lot of other things that are hemming the AF in and making it unlikely that we go rogue and read new in every round. Lastly, number 5, they could still have solvency cards about their counterplans if our AF is new. For example, no matter how new our AF is, your advantage counterplans always have solvency evidence. So just read the advantage counterplans. You could still have large counterplans that deal with big themes of the topic. They just don't have to do the AF. It is a little nonsensical to me to say that all new affirmative debates should be debates where the affirmative reads new and the negative goes for a counterplan that includes all or part of the plan text, which are really the only counterplans that get written out by not having a solvency advocate, because everything else you could cut cards about before the debate, no matter what the AF you're debating is. Or if they're in the 1AC, you could just cut those cards during the 1AC or during other time in the debate. Now, there are 2 other arguments I want to go over that the negative is likely to say. One of those arguments is that what a solvency advocate is really arbitrary. And I think that this is kind of the like best argument that the negative has. This argument is like, it is unpredictable what a solvency advocate is. For example, if your standard is that a solvency advocate shows that something is in the literature, what if I cut a card from a blog that says that the plan should occur? What if I cut a card from a really, really qualified blog? Does that mean that it's in the literature? Does my evidence have to be from a peer-reviewed journal? Does my evidence have to say the counterplan text exactly? Or how close does it have to be to saying the counterplan? Pushing back on all of these things, I think generally is able to help the negative very strongly because they can point out that they do have something that is close enough. This can be particularly dangerous for the affirmative if the affirmative does not have a great solvency advocate. So when I was debating, we actually won a debate against a team that said we needed to have a solvency advocate on the argument that the affirmative does not have a card that says the plan text in it. And the affirmative team was really mad about this. And the judge was like, well, on their counterplan, you set the bright line as they need a card that says the counterplan text. So the corollary is you need a card that says the plan text. Okay, this means that one of 2 things has to happen. Thing 1, you literally need a card that says the plan text should occur. If you want to set the bright line really high for what constitutes a negative solvency advocate, you need a really, really, really good and specific solvency advocate. Fortunately, that does exist for a lot of the apps on this topic. Like the Cyber Article 5 app does have a card that says the US should propose to NATO that Article 5 include attacks on cyber and the word armed attack be incorporated into the treaty. That literally like does exist. If you're reading an app that doesn't have one of those solvency advocates, maybe this set of theory arguments suggests that that is not so good. The second thing is you could be a little looser on your definition of solvency advocate. You could say something like a solvency advocate is just something that says that the action of the plan should be taken by the actor, and be like, here is our card that says that. The only issue with that is the looser you are about that definition, the stronger the negatives we meet argument is that just, well, we have some cards that kind of hint at the thing we're talking about as well. Obviously, this would still be like cardless con or a process counterplan that has no evidence, or even a counterplan in the 1NC that has no cards, but you are setting yourself up for a little bit of danger, which you should always be aware of. Does that kind of make a little bit of sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. The other part about what is a solvency advocate that is really important is what are the qualifications of it that I talked about a little bit before. If I'm negative, one of the things that I want to say is like, okay, but here is a card from my WordPress or my Medium that just advocates for this thing. So like, that's good enough, right? And if you're affirmative, you obviously want to say that's not what you mean. If you're affirmative, you obviously mean that this is someone who is qualified writing about this in somewhere that is actually published. But as you go down the line of defining this, it becomes easier and easier for the negative to point out that what you're saying is arbitrary. So if you're negative, what is a solvency advocate is definitely somewhere that you want to push back along. Okay, the last thing that the negative will likely do in this debate, or should do if they have the capacity, is in the 2NC, they should just read something that they say is a solvency advocate. So the 2NC is like, here is a new piece of evidence that is a solvency advocate for our counterclaim. Now, if this is the case, I think that for the affirmative, you want to say that this means that in the 1NC, they did not put forward a complete argument, so the 1AR can make any new arguments to answer this counterplan that they want. And it is totally reasonable and totally fair because as of the 1NC, they had not made a full argument, so the 2AC had no burden to respond to it. That would mean that you can get new offensive arguments on the counterplan or new solvency deficits or any new evidence. It might also mean, if you're willing to play a little bit fast and loose, that you could read a new add-on because that is your best solvency deficit to the counterplan, or even that you could interact with the net benefit a little differently. So you could try to justify basically any new argument on the basis of the new solvency card. The other thing is like, even when the 2NC reads our card that's like, here is our new solvency advocate, I would bet basically any amount of money that it is not actually a solvency advocate that says that we ought do the counterclaim. So it likely still does not resolve the offensive arguments that you have put forward. Does that all check out?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah. So the 1AR, we've kind of talked through all of the arguments that you would have to answer. If you were giving the 2NR on this argument, which I think is fairly unlikely to occur, I think that you want to pick one or two of your best offensive arguments. Make sure to include impact comparison when extending them. And then, I think that definitely one of the arguments you want is about how the interpretation of a solvency advocate is arbitrary and it would result in eliminating all counterclaims. I think the other important thing about this, as with most theory arguments, is in the 2NR, I think you need to explain why this outweighs affirmative ground. By which I mean, there are structural ways that the affirmative can deal with all of the counterplans that we're talking about. When you all are in lab talking about affirmatives on the first day, I'm guessing the odds are that you didn't start on the first day with here are solvency cards for every counterplan. Rather, your lab leaders probably said, hey, does this have an intuitive response to the following types of things? Does it have an intuitive NATO key warrant? Does it have an intuitive United States key warrant? Does it have an intuitive security cooperation key warrant, etc.? You should put forward the argument that the affirmative should be able to beat large swaths of counterplans without specific evidence, as long as they have cards that say the plan is key. So these shouldn't really be large concerns for the affirmative, an affirmative ground will ultimately be okay. And that's an important defensive argument to the large majority of what the AF wants to go for. The other thing is you could put forward that these counterplans are predictable enough because we know that we have to prepare for the advantages not being intrinsic when writing an advantage, and all of our counterplans disprove the viability of the affirmative. In other words, if it is true that the counterplan disproves the plan text, then the affirmative should be ready to answer it by saying that their plan text is true. Some people phrase this argument as saying the negative has to prepare for anything that is topical. The affirmative on the corollary has to prepare for anything that disproves the plan. Okay, cool. For the 2AR on this set of arguments, I think that it is very important to explain the set of damage that cardless counterplans or counterplans without solvency cards or not in the literature could do to the affirmative, and why that damage is more important than getting rid of some counterplans for the negative. And I would phrase it kind of like this. If you get counterplans that the affirmative cannot prepare for and cannot write a 1AC around, the affirmative will lose every debate. We will never be able to write a 1AC predicated on answering negative arguments because we don't know what negative arguments we have to answer. This means at the minimum, the 1NC will always start the debate with a counterplan that solves the entirety of our case that we will have no way of being able to answer, and we'll have to start the debate in the 2AC. To make matters worse, there is no reason that we would ever have 2AC evidence that is any good to answer large swaths of what they're saying. So we will always be behind on the debate from the 2AC onward. Now that outweighs the utility of these counterplans for negative strategy, because even if they win, that we get rid of every single counterplan ever, the negative will still be okay. If the negative wins a counterplan, it deletes the entire 1AC, so the affirmative is terminally doomed. If the negative doesn't get counterplans and they win, even that our interpretation results in 0 negative counterplans being read, they are still perfectly fine because they can beat us on dissad outweighs the case, on critiques, or on topicality arguments. But they don't even have an internal link to us eliminating all counterplans because advantage counterplans will always have solvency advocates. So I think that that type of 2AR that kind of, it does a lot of comparison and a lot of even if statements is really necessary if you're going for this type of argument. The other thing that I think is a very useful and funny tool in the AF bag is you want to kind of say that there is no other way for us to limit out bad process counterplans. It would ultimately be very arbitrary and very difficult to come up with an interpretation that limits out the consult counterplan, the conditions counterplan, the international counterplan, et cetera, without being very arbitrary. So you want to say the only way that we can limit out that set of counterplans is by determining if they have solvency advocates about the plan. Any other way to try to get rid of them is either super anti-educational, super anti-predictable, or just not one that judges are going to vote on, which means that it is worse for affirmative and negative ground. Cool. That's kind of my whole rant about why the affirmative shouldn't need solvency advocates. I'm going to turn off the recording now and we can do some Q&A.